you want me to count to three?
Hey, it's Meredith Stowers at Loan Depot and the ADU Coalition, interviewing a really special guest at a great time, Denis DeSaix with Metrocal Appraisal, but he is a key leader at the Appraisal Institute of Northern California. He's been training appraisers across the state, including Loan Depot's sub-panel of renovation appraisers on how to appraise ADUs. Now, Denis, appraising ADUs has been very controversial with all this stuff, very positive. It's been kind of a crook in the loan process. Tell me what the controversy is about.
Yeah, well, as you and your audience knows, California in the last couple of years passed some very significant ADU rules and regulations which affect all jurisdictions in the state of California. California is taking the lead in ADU forefront, but this is a trend that's also emerging across the nation. Nobody has made a statewide regulation such as California, but certainly certain cities in different regions of the country are also adopting a more flexible ADU regulation and zoning. So in the past, local jurisdictions could limit the opportunities for ADU development within certain zoning districts. And the thought process was, gee, we want to keep this a single family neighborhood, and we don't want to create multiple units on the same lots and have it migrate or transform into a more of a rental type of district. Obviously, the big pressure for ADUs has been affordable housing, especially in California, but also in the more dense urban areas across the country. And that's where you're seeing these adaptations being brought to the forefront. So as an appraiser, what the challenge has been is comparables. The gold standard of appraising for mortgage finance is finding that comparable with the same type of element or amenity or attribute. And so lenders have been, and not only the lenders themselves, but Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have been pretty stringent on what they require for appraisals that are going to be acceptable to them with ADUs. And that's put a limit. That has created a limitation on how appraisers can find that data to use in support of their values. So the controversy, the conflict, the friction has been up to this point, ADUs were treated, oh, you know, this is kind of a one-off thing. It's no longer a one-off thing. It's definitely an emerging trend. And when anything is an emerging trend, there's going to be a little catch-up involved. And that's what we're doing. We're finding lenders and appraisers catching up to where the market is already going.
So the previous ADU guidelines, they required at least one comparable sale, but if a neighborhood doesn't have a comparable sale, what were you allowed to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the previous requirements stated, and these are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac requirements, which pretty much drive most of the residential mortgage guidelines. The previous requirements were if your subject, if the borrower's property had an ADU, then you needed to go out and find what we call a comparable property with an ADU. And comparable means that it means that it should be similar to the subject in the important attributes. And then we would use that as a demonstration to the lender that says not only are ADUs in this market, but homes sell with ADUs, they're marketable. And then we would use that that difference, that ADU and the comparable, as part of our valuation process.
Now, ADUs can be pretty big. Couldn't you compare them to regular homes? Like a similar home, not an ADU, but a home? Or how could you compare them to a duplex?
Yeah, the short answer is no, because it's not really like for like. So what is an ADU? It's an accessory to the primary unit. A duplex is an income property that typically, but not always, is pretty harmonious in size. Picture a side-by-side duplex, attached. They're probably 2-bedroom, 1-bath configuration. They're both about the same size. In an ADU, by definition, there is a restriction on the size. In California, there's no restriction on the ability to rent the ADUs, but in other jurisdictions there are. And so comparing it to a duplex wouldn't be ideal, because in a duplex, you have the ability to rent them both out, et cetera, et cetera. An ADU it does not fit. It's not a true like-for-like comparison. Same thing with a single-family house. ADUs don't have land value, and single-family houses do.
Wait a minute, doesn't an ADU on land? What do you mean they don't have land value?
Because the land is attributable to the primary unit. Let's assume that we have a house with no ADU. So that house is worth $750,000, let's say. And let's just assume that the improvement is worth half of that, $375,000, and the land underneath is worth the other half, $375,000. Now, if we add an ADU, the land value doesn't change. It's already in the primary unit's valuation. So the ADU contributes for its improvement, but not the land.
So let's say I plan to rent my ADU, or I have the potential to rent my ADU like a duplex. Can't you use that future rental value?
As for mortgage financing with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as of current, they won't count that income. There are some special loan programs that they have where they may consider it, but in general, for what most people consider the conventional loan, no, it's not counted. So a traditional income approach for an ADU is problematic, one, because the income can't be counted for the loan, and also two, because the data used to find out, we can find out how much ADUs are renting for. There's data for that. But then to convert that into a multiplier or a cap rate to do the value, it's very difficult and complicated on the single family residential level. It can be done, but it is difficult and in all real ways not practical. An alternative, though, income should be mentioned in the appraisal report, and I would advise anybody who is getting refinance or borrowing money for the ADU, if they have a rental plan, that they share that information with the appraiser, because the rental information can help support a claim of, hey, the ADU is worth this much and this is why, and gee, look, the ADU generates $2,000 a month. That's $24,000 a year. In 4.5 or 5 years on a gross basis, you've paid back the cost of the ADU. It's kind of hard to go out and find another real estate investment that you can get your payback period that quickly.
Well, that's a great point. Just because the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac guidelines, don't go along, doesn't mean it's not a great investment. These guidelines, or the original guidelines, not the ones that just changed, they date back to what, the 50s, the 60s?
Well, I wouldn't know. You weren't born yet, and I was still riding a tricycle back then. But they've been around. They change them slowly but surely. But for all intents and purposes, this has been the rule since the beginning of the 2000s, late 90s, 2000s, of how they used to require an appraisal to be presented when the subject has an ADU. As you just mentioned, they came out with a new directive just a couple of days ago. So this is a very timely subject. And they've allowed a little more flexibility. Before, I said that the appraisal was required to have a comparable sale with an ADU if my subject had an ADU. Now they've made it a little more flexible. They've said you don't need it comparable, but what you do need is to demonstrate that there are ADUs in this neighborhood and they have sold. So now appraisers can go back in time and say, gee, 3 years ago, here's a sale with an ADU. And Fannie and Freddie will say, okay, that's great, but that was 3 years ago and we'll accept that. But now can you find us a listing and a pending with an ADU? because that demonstrates that, hey, they exist in the market and they have sold, and the listing and pending demonstrates, and they're being marketed today.
Because ADUs are very hot among buyers. And I think you've recommended that appraisers talk to realtors about ADUs in that neighborhood. About why would they talk to realtors about active sales?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the realtors are on the street daily talking to people who are actually buying and selling these properties. Appraisers, and I believe that we have a good thumb on the pulse of the market, but a good realtor who works that market knows it inside and out, knows who's going to sell, knows who's thinking of selling, knows what's going on there, et cetera, et cetera. So appraisers should interview and discuss and talk with the realtors, and we have that ability. There is some belief that sometimes appraisers and realtors aren't supposed to talk because of concerns of appraiser independence, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the case. We can share information and we can talk all day, and the agents and brokers are actually the market participants. So if we interview them, what's going on? Are your buyers looking for this specifically? And most important, how do they price it? That's information which is golden.
It's very cool because in the past, given those pretty strict limitations on guidelines, and I want to add, the past and even now, you can't count that extra square footage in the ADU, even if it's attached to the house. You can't include that as part of the house square footage. It is a separate unit, correct?
That is correct. And again, that goes back to how these are defined, not only for most lending purposes, but actually in the zoning requirements. Their legal permissibility states that they are an accessory, a subunit to the primary. Every ADU regulation that I've seen puts a limit on size. In Fannie Mae's case, they specifically say that it must be secondary, can't be larger than the primary.
But let's say I have a single family home that's 3-bedroom, 2-bath, and I build an ADU that's 2-bedroom, 1-bath. I can't go compare that to houses that are 5-bedroom, 3 bathrooms.
You can't, because that, and that would be an inappropriate comparison, because the only thing that they have in common is the size and the bed and bath count. Other than that, they're not the same. They're two different houses. You know, a large family might want the 5-bedroom. A large family may not want the 3-bedroom, et cetera, et cetera. They're not comparable. However, it is possible that the value of the ADU is similar in value to what we would describe as the difference somebody would pay for a 2,000 square foot house versus a 3,000 square foot house. So it may have a similar value as living area, but it would be inappropriate to compare it to a larger size home, because it's the buyer of the larger size home is not the same buyer for the smaller home with an ADU.
So these new rules give you greater value based on the current market, not necessarily the past market. And that in the past, lenders have had challenges. Just why the reason why this matters is lenders have in some neighborhoods gotten literally zero goose egg value for an appraisal. I don't think that's right. But they're certainly not getting the full cost of the construction. That doesn't mean it's a bad investment. The cash flow might make a ton of sense, but the problem is, as a lender, I can't loan to that full value. So we know that we've talked with Fannie Mae in the past, last year, they came to our conference. We know that they changed, they had not been tracking ADUs according to the appraisal form. In March, they changed the form. Now they're tracking ADUs. They have a working group on ADUs, and they came out with a report in July that provided some research on the hot trend of ADUs based on MLS data, because they didn't, like I said, they hadn't been tracking data. And now they have these initial guidelines that are moving toward a more current view of ADUs. What was the other part of these new guidelines that's really significant?
Oh, the other part is that they have made it clear now that a manufactured home can be eligible as an ADU. They have a specific requirement in that it has to be a HUD conforming manufactured home, and the primary unit must always be bigger, and the primary unit has to be a stick and brick improvement. So I couldn't have a manufactured home and then bring on another manufactured home and have that called an ADU, because Fannie and Freddie are saying no, primary must be stick and brick. ADU, of course, you can use a manufactured home, which is actually great because not only with appraisers, but also with lenders. Like you say, Meredith, this is something new and it's an emerging trend. And Fannie has a working group, and Freddie Mac have working groups on, okay, how do we as lenders, how do we as buyers of securities, how do we evolve along with this trend to make sure that A, loans are available for this because this is where people are going, and B, we do it soundly and safely. So we are now we're following the trend, but we're moving. Before we weren't moving, we were stuck in the mud. Now we are moving with the trend, which is great news.
So it is great news. So should people who are investing in ADUs now under these new guidelines, generally speaking, and I know that's a very vague term, generally speaking, should they expect 100% appraisal value for their ADU based on the construction costs?
So yeah, that is a great question, and I'll have to break it down. They should expect 100% appraised value for the ADU, but 100% appraised value doesn't necessarily translate into cost, and it doesn't necessarily translate into an income factor. We are still required to be able to prove a contributory value for the ADU. And when you have limited data, that becomes a challenge. It becomes a challenge not only for the appraiser and the appraisal report, it becomes a challenge for the lender. In the perfect world, the lender would want all comparables to have the ADUs, so there's no question about how much. There wouldn't be adjustments in the sales grid if all comparables had the same ADUs. We wouldn't have to worry about it. That's not the case. Maybe 5 to 10 years from now. It's not the case today. So your question was, what can a borrower expect or an investor expect if they're going to make the decision to construct an ADU on their property? Let's assume that costs $175,000. How much value can they expect to get in return on an appraisal from that $175,000? I can't tell you. I can tell you that that in logic argues that it definitely contributes value. The market data is out there, but sometimes it's very hard to find. This is an emerging trend. So many appraisers are really getting up to speed on this now. In some markets we have ADUs, and there's appraisers who deal with that all the time. But now, because of the law change, and you can pretty much build an ADU almost anywhere, in those markets where it wasn't prevalent, appraisers and lenders are trying to play catch up. So my best advice for anybody who's getting refinancing or proposing to build an ADU and is doing it through financing is work with the lender and do your best to select an appraiser who has the experience of valuing properties with ADUs. Not every appraiser does. They will eventually, but not every appraiser does now.
Well, and I want to be clear on that because that is an important point. By law, lenders cannot choose an appraiser. We can choose an appraisal panel, and you cannot be affiliated with us. Loan Depot chooses to create our own panels And we've actually created a sub panel of renovation appraisals, but I can't choose who the appraiser is. It's by lottery. Now, let me ask you this. So I've had, to me as a lender, this is a very collaborative process because we don't know what the appraisal is going to come back. And I've had appraisals come back 30,000 short. I've had them come back 70,000 short. Now, the example of the one in 70,000 short is actually pretty classic what you're talking about. This area has essentially, this is a neighborhood, and I see entire swaths of even cities like Vista, California, that really doesn't have any ADUs, at least not right now. The new market and the new rules might improve that, but it is very hard to find comparable sales, and they got dinged for that. And the rental income, even with the income model, doesn't make sense. So so here's what borrowers can do, and what we immediately did was ask for an appraisal review from our appraisal team. We hired an outside appraiser to review the appraisal, and the outside appraiser agreed. Can the borrower demand another appraisal?
The borrower can go through what's called a reconsideration process. And it's similar to what you just described. Mm-hmm. So I'm the borrower. I get a appraisal back on my house, and I have some disputes with the findings. So what can I do? I can request from my lender, because it has to go through the lender, that a reconsideration of value be done. Ideally, I'm going to have some market data to share. It's going to be tough for me to argue and say, gee, I don't like the comps you picked. It's much more persuasive for me to say, gee, I don't like the comps you picked in the report, and here's some that sold on my block that are in the same time period, that are in the same size range. Mm-hmm. So having data is the best way to go. I think for this discussion, we're talking, let's make a hypothetical here. I just spent $150,000 building an ADU, and the appraisal report comes back and says it's worth $10,000.
Right, which has happened.
Which has happened, yeah. I think in that case, while the borrower may not have the ability to gather information as far as sales comps, and we should presume that's probably the case, because if the appraiser couldn't find it, how am I, as John Q. Public, supposed to find it?
Right.
But they can put together a logical argument. Hey, I just built this. It cost me $150,000. Mm-hmm. There is demand for this. I'm renting it out. I'm renting it out right now at whatever the rate I'm renting at. And there were 10 applicants coming to me for it. Mm-hmm. I believe the $10,000 is probably not reflective of what the market value is. This goes to the lender, and then, Meredith, it's you guys that have to evaluate that and then say, oh, you have a legitimate case here, and then we'll take it to the appraiser.
Right.
When it gets to the appraiser is obligated to consider it, but is under no obligation to make any changes. And that's where the friction is created. Because if the appraiser believes that, hey, I've done everything I could to search the market and it's just not there, the data, and this is where I'm coming at, unless you can give me something better, I'm not budging from this. That's where the conflict exists. There's a way to get around this. Just because I have no ADUs in my particular neighborhood doesn't mean I can't go to another neighborhood, a competing neighborhood. I mean, this is not only appropriate per our professional appraisal standards, but it's consistent with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac guidelines. So we have that ability. When you start to get to that level, the appraisal becomes pretty complex, and it becomes pretty time consuming. So there's challenges there.
Yeah, but you can't just say, hey, I don't like what you said. You've got to come in understanding what the guideline limitations are that we talked about, having data that fits within that guidelines. In other words, you can't just say, well, the house down the street with six bedrooms just sold, so why can't we compare that? That would be the inappropriate
comparison.
Right. So given that Fannie continues to work on this, any predictions on the next set of guideline changes?
Yeah, I mean, I would reasonably believe that the next step is to be able to include the income
The
in
future
the
rental
analysis.
income.
You
Yeah.
know, I mean, they do it with 2 to 4s, right? And that's probably another item of why we have to be careful as appraisers to properly identify the properties.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a single family with an ADU or is it a duplex? Because if we misidentify what the property is, the lender could easily misidentify the loan type.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that both the lender and the appraiser want to avoid at all costs.
Oh, yeah.
So I think the income is probably going to be the next change, and I think that they will consider the income as a qualifier.
Boy, that would sure be exciting, especially for young people who are just buying their first home and looking at a renovation loan to both purchase and build, to be able to consider the future rental income they would have in the same way as if they were buying a duplex, would make a huge difference to young folks just getting started out. Or
It absolutely would be significant. What I see now, the majority of the new construction ADUs that are occurring now are what I would call the middle to upper price bands,
mm-hmm.
where I think it's safe to assume that they have the economic wherewithal
Yeah.
to either pay for this cash or get financing without worrying about, you know, how the ADU fits into it. But
Yeah.
really, the ADU change was designed to help the middle to lower
Mm-hmm.
price bands. So these ADUs are really a great idea in the neighborhoods which they're not the new neighborhoods and they're not the ones with all the money.
Right.
That's where we need the housing, and I think that was the intent of the legislation. And and the good news is both Fannie and Freddie are required by law to assist in home ownership, so they have a focus there too. So that's why I'm pretty confident sooner or later we're going to be able to move to that situation, that better place where income is counted, and that's going to be extremely helpful for the ones who are building this as an income stream.
So we're on the bleeding edge of homeownership affordability, and we're having glitches like we just got a new Apple phone. But stay tuned. Denis, thank you so much for being a leader on this, for training all the great appraisers out there. You have a great training coming up. If you haven't signed up, email me or go to the Appraisal Institute of Northern California and sign up today. It is continuing education, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And it's one of the hottest trends coming up if you want to get involved. So thank you so much today, Denis.
Thank you. Have a great one.